Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, her new novel is called Village Weavers. Myriam J.A. Chancy joins me on the show to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
My pleasure. I want to start with the dedication page, or rather the quotations that you have from Virginia Woolf and a quote from the book of Genesis.
Yes.
Because did you have these in hand before you started writing the book, or did you find them in the process of writing the book? Like, are they the seed from which the book flowers?
I'm also a literary critic, so part of what happens is that as I'm writing, I'm thinking about things that are related to the themes that might guide the reader. And so as I was writing this, I knew I had given lectures on Virginia Woolf and women's writing in the past, and this particular quote kept coming back. Like this is the Chloe like to Olivia quote from Room of One's Own, where, it ends, sometimes women do like women. And her whole point in the essay is that there's not enough of literature that focuses on women's relationship to other women. And this novel does that. It focuses on girls and women, mothers and daughters, sisters, extended family members, who are women. And so I thought this quote would be appropriate. So it cues the reader into the theme, one of the big thematics of a novel. And then the Genesis quote is because as I was writing, I kept thinking there's something in Genesis about, multiplying, right? And filling the waters and the seas is the quote here. And that's related to the title of the novel, Village Weavers, which is both, a euphemism for what the girls who become women in this novel are creating in their relationship with one another and other women in their lives. But it is also a reference to the male village weavers who creates many nests and has many offspring, which is part of a sort of a secret in the novel.
And it's also a piece of artwork in the book.
It is, yes, because one of the girls becomes an artist later in life. This is Simone, also known as SiSi, and when you open the novel, she is working on a village weaver painting, which eventually travels through the novel and finds another owner later on. I won't give it away.
Yeah, I don't want to break any secrets in terms of the flow of the book, but it opens with that. But I mean, obviously the book back and forths a lot between a lot of timelines. Was that something that you conceived of from the start, that this would kind of bounce around, or did you have kind of like one period as kind of the entryway for you for the writing, and then decide to kind of, I don't want to say complicate things, but shake things up?
Well, what inspired the novel partly was the passing of my mother in 2019. My mother and father, my father is still alive, were both living in Winnipeg at the time, and my mother passed on, and some of her siblings in other parts of the world passed on around the same time. So it was like a whole generation of people just disappeared, and who were born in the 30s and 20s in Haiti. And with them, seemed to me disappeared a lot of stories and memories about that time period, which was a really flourishing cultural moment for Haiti. This is before, the advent of a dictatorship in the late 50s. And so I wanted to capture that. And then as I was thinking through, well, how do I get back to the 40s and make it pertinent to a contemporary reader? I thought, well, I really want to think about the relationships that people who were born in this period but then had to leave during the Duvalier regime created in other parts of the world. And so that's why, the novel focuses on two girls who meet in Haiti in grade school when they're 7 years old, and then discover a family secret, and, which breaks them up, or other people, break them apart once this secret is revealed, and then follows them through life as they attempt to, reconcile what happened to them in childhood and the connection they might still have as they become older ladies. So it takes you from when they're 7 to their 60s, with a middle section, which is when they re-meet in middle age in their 40s with teenage daughters. So in trying to talk about that early period, the 40s to 50s, I was navigating, how do I get back to that period? So that's why we started a present Davis in the early 2000s, and then I bring the reader back into the memory of those characters, back to the 40s when they met, and then in the middle section, going from the 70s, which is when they're in their 40s, 70s, 80s, back to the 50s and 60s when they were young women and were not, in each other's lives.
For the 40s era, did you had your parents talked much about Haiti during that time? Like, did you draw on what you could
Yeah.
recall of their discussions of it?
Yeah, so my father has talked a lot and just recently talked to me about the fact that his father, so my paternal grandfather, actually had a hand in building some of the buildings in the expo, which are still there. Some are still there. Obviously, some of them fell during the 2010 earthquake. But he was a construction person and then a foreman before he became an undertaker later in life. But he, as a young person, actually built those buildings, which Haitians were very proud of. So my father would talk about that period. My mother would talk about, how vibrant that period was. But for the novel, I had to do a lot of research so I remembered those stories, but I personally didn't know, the extent of what went on during the expo in particular. But what was funny is that as I was digging into it, finding out that Miles Davis had been there, Dizzy Gillespie, the Cuban singer Celia Cruz, and then we had our own singer who became internationally famous as a result of the expo. Her name was Martha Jean-Claude. I discovered that I actually had inherited from my parents, an LP of her music from that period. I had it in my belongings, and as I was writing, I was like, oh my God, I actually have the LP because I discovered the cover during my research online. And I was like, I have the actual physical LP from that period. And I actually have a turntable. So I put it on a turntable and I would play it while I was writing that section of a novel.
Was that Chant Haiti, the Voodoo Experience, that one?
This is well, it's a range of songs. Oh, you mean the title of the actual
The
LP?
of the Martha Jean Claude LP? Do you
I
know?
don't recall right now actually what the name of it, but it was from the 40s, and so I remember just the cover. So it's a uh, like a drawing of her
Okay.
in red, and you do see some drums in the front. So you might have the right title. I don't have it
Well,
in front of me.
I'm curious because in reading the book, I didn't know anything about the expo in Haiti, and I looked it up and then
Ah,
listened to her record, and it's quite good. So I do want to recommend
yeah,
folks
absolutely.
check that record out. So yeah, in terms of the research, then, are you pulling like newspaper archives from the time, or what goes into that research to kind of rebuild that world or recreate that world on your page?
Yeah, well, some of it came from personal archives. So my mother had left me a volume of photographs, really from her whole life in Haiti and then early period in Paris, where she had lived for some time. And so I went through those photographs with a different eye because I was no longer looking, for family members or this kind of thing. I was looking more for what those photographs captured of fashion. How did women dress in the 40s and the 50s? What it might capture of the environment, what Port-au-Prince looked like, even what Paris looked like, in the early 60s. And then I did some online research for the expo. What was interesting is I found a young Haitian had created a mapping of all of the sites of the expo online, and that's published on HaitiNet. And so I was able to access that map and really, look at things and then compare, with today's maps, Google Maps. So it's both archival and then online with people, doing their own archival research and putting it in online resources, which is great for a fiction writer because then you don't have to go through, actual physical archives, especially given the fact that so much of the archives in Port-au-Prince themselves have been destroyed.
How concerned are you with fidelity when it comes to recreating a time or a specific place? Like, do you
Yeah, it's a
maybe
good
discard
question.
some things sometimes when it just doesn't work narratively, or are you hemmed in
Um,
by that?
So I'm careful because, I am from Port-au-Prince. I'm known as a Haitian scholar, and I do know that I have readers who are also themselves Haitian, and maybe still reside in Haiti, who are looking for reflections of themselves. And of course, I'm not writing for a particular audience, but I also want to be, as I think anyone should be, sensitive to those who live in the places that I write about, whether it's Haiti or the Dominican Republic or, Paris in this case. So I'm trying to be historically accurate, but I do take some liberties. So, for example, I mentioned that Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis, were at the expo, performed at the expo in Port-au-Prince in 49 to 50. But I decided that it was for the fictional version, it would be fun to have them sort of interacting and being taken by the locals to a voodoo ceremony. I don't know that that happened. I think it would be fun if it did. And
Right.
that's what you can do with fiction, is kind of depart from the historical record. But it is true that they were there. What they did there, I don't know,
So
aside from perform.
right. We talked about the timelines kind of bouncing around. You also bounce around between Gertie and SiSi's perspectives, and
Yes.
I'm curious to know, is it harder to write one or the other of them, or like equally difficult because you're trying to inhabit both of them? What kind of process was that like for you?
Yeah, so, I was trying to think through what might it have been like to be these young girls. They come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Cece is being raised in a family of women who are not as wealthy. It's a working class family. Gertie or Gertrude is being raised in a very wealthy family, though she's somewhat of an outcast because of colorism issues in her family. So she's a little bit darker skinned, and so she's mistreated by some of her older siblings because of that. But interestingly, in her case, it is the door that opens her way of thinking about others. But she's going to have to throughout her life battle what she's been taught to think about people who are not of the same class, not of the same color, whereas Cece is much more open, to others because she comes from a less privileged background, even though she is quote unquote lighter skin. So I wanted to, be faithful to what it might be like to be from either of those class backgrounds and positions. And that's why I wanted to go back and forth between the two rather than give one, the story in its entirety. Because I think the more voices there are, and actually this is my first novel to have fewer, than five voices actually, is keeping to two. And I just think it gives a richness of perspective to have more than one voice. And in this case, it's also because part of what they find out about their connection to each other has to do with their relationship to the Dominican Republic. And I wanted to be able to give a different understanding of what that relationship might be like, depending on one's background coming from the Haitian side. For your listeners might not know that there is a very tense relationship between the DR and Haiti politically, but that might not be the case for everyday Haitians, especially if they have more mobility, between the two countries, which is Gertie's case. So it's a lot to try to capture, but by having the two voices, I'm able to navigate those differences and give a fullness to the perspectives, I think.
Did you have familial ties to the DR as well, or like did you look at that as
Yes.
something you kind of explored just in fiction? Yes, you're saying yes. So
Yeah, I have a Dominican grandfather, and who's Haitian. So I have to hasten to say that he's Haitian but of Dominican descent, which is, I'm told more unusual. So usually we hear about Dominicans of Haitian descent, Haitians who've gone over to the DR for different reasons. But I
mhm.
have a grandfather who, in fact, did the opposite, or whose family did the opposite. So I do have that relationship. I've been to the DR a few times. But of course, I've experienced some of the things that I captured in the novel. For example, SiSi, who goes for the first time and then finds that she's discriminated against because she's Haitian. I've had that experience personally, even though to most Dominicans I look like a Dominican. But once they find out that I'm Haitian, depending on the class, depending on where I am in the DR, then there might be some friction. And so I lent my experience to SiSi in that respect.
Did that happen to you as an adult?
It did.
Because
It
I was
did.
curious that like this obviously happens to SiSi, in the period in which she's in her 40s.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so the way that someone responds to something like that as an adult versus, encountering it as a child can be manifestly different just in terms of like where
Sure.
they are in their life. So when you're drawing on your own experience, then did it make sense for CC to encounter this as an adult woman so that kind of the headspace would be similar, or at least kind of something that you're
So
drawing on in
yeah,
that way?
so what I do in the novel, and I think every fiction writer does this, there's a part of you that's in every character, even though you have to distance yourself from the character, so the narrative voice is their own, right? I tend to want my characters to guide me rather than I guide the characters. But if I know that a character is going to be in a particular environment or setting, and I have had an experience that might be similar to what I know they're going to be facing, then I draw on the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings I might have had in that encounter and lend them to that individual. And so that's what I did in that section where Cece goes as an adult, and it is her first time to the DR, and she doesn't have the experience she thought she would have. And so that was for me a credible, it was a moment where I could lend credibility, to what she experienced by drawing on my experience. Now, on the other hand, Gertie, who also has that connection, goes to the DR far more frequently. And she goes there as a child for the first time for one of her older sister's weddings. And she also experiences some discrimination because, as I mentioned
Right.
before,
She's
she's of
darker.
darker
Yes.
skin. But she doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't understand it. And so that speaks to what you're saying about the difference of how one might react to discrimination as a child as opposed to an adult, where you can do something about what is happening, or maybe even you understand what is happening and you can do something about it. When Gertie experiences that discrimination as a child, she doesn't know what it means. Her father tries to help her to understand or to move past it, but she still doesn't register what he's talking about until much later. And then when she encounters things of this kind in the DR with, Cece, when they re-meet in the Dominican Republic, the ways in which she navigates this friction between Haitians and Dominicans isn't something that sits well with Cece. And so Gertie is in some ways still learning certain things about, the two sides of the island and that discrimination against Haitians and darker skinned people, even though she herself, I'll give away a little piece of the story here, is guilty of manifesting some of that, prejudice when she meets her to-be husband, Manuel, for the first time at the end of her teens in the DR. So there's a lot here about class and colorism to kind of disentangle, which is part of a journey of each character.
Right. And the awareness that Gertie fails to have as a child, like it makes sense in the context of, she's very young. But
She's
as she goes
seven,
along,
6 or 7.
the she kind of manifests that same like inability to see some things.
Hmm.
And I'm curious
Yeah.
about kind of like her like consciousness in like her journey, that it comes later than Cece like seems to
Yes.
be raised in a very different, I guess, because she has Gertie has the wealth to kind of be oblivious.
Yeah, exactly. She has class privilege. And so even though she experiences certain prejudices, some of which she doesn't fully understand, as I was just saying, as a child, she's able to kind of leap over them later on as she gets older. or, the class privilege kind of gives her a kind of cocoon where she can ignore certain things and even replicate, certain attitudes which she's been taught by her family. And she only begins to shed those in her marriage. But then, even then, because she marries a wealthy Dominican, so even though he is a Black Dominican, he's also very wealthy. This cocoons her from certain experiences and certain realities that she doesn't realize she needs to shed until she's much older. Whereas SiSi is having to navigate these issues all the time.
How much of that is baked in terms of like when you come up with the character, like do you have a sense of who they are, or does that work itself out in terms of how they respond to certain situations you put them in?
I think, that's a complicated question to answer. I think, one begins with an idea, and mine was, oh, I'm really interested in this idea of two childhood friends, because I think we all have this experience of really connecting, to other people when we're children, when we go to school. And then being initiated into their lives and discovering that other people live completely differently than how, we might be in our own families. And it's just sometimes a wonderful experience. Sometimes it's shocking, but it changes you, right? And so then as I explored how those two lives then develop very differently, especially after they discover how they're connected, through that family secret, I wanted to follow through on how those lives really develop quite differently because of the class issues in particular. And then there are certain things that you don't expect the characters to do. Like when you keep following, so at the beginning you have an idea and you pursue it, but then when you develop the characters and the characters become full human beings, and in some ways as a writer, you're simply conveying their attitudes, their perspectives, and they're telling you what they would do in XYZ situation. There are things that sometimes are surprising. So, for example, with SiSi, she has an older sister, Margie, who leaves the island, before the Duvalier regime, and then returns kind of a few years before the regime is really getting off to a start. And that young woman is an activist, and she's really involved in, social rights and women's rights, and then has to leave the island because of that. And SiSi will follow, later. And when SiSi leaves and ends up in Paris, she re-meets a childhood friend of both hers and Gertie, Lou. And that young woman, who's of Italian descent, but also Haitian, is much more, open to so many different things. And SiSi wants to be like Lou and wants to be like Margie, her older sister, but then realizes that she doesn't have that level, that fortitude. It's not to say that it's wrong, but it's just that she doesn't have, the strength in a certain kind of way. And that was something that, as I wrote the novel, was surprising to me in a certain sense. But, many of us have to face, if you were having to climb a high mountain all the time in your life, and then you're faced with a choice, do I want to live a quiet life and express myself in the ways that I can, or do I want to be on the front lines? I think many of us will choose not to be in the front lines. Not all of us are built for that. And so that's SiSi's decision. And even though Gertie is not as aware of multiple identities, multiple marginalizations as is SiSi, what's interesting about her is that she becomes a social worker because she's motivated to change people's lives. And SiSi, as you mentioned before, at the onset of our conversation, becomes an artist. So it's just very interesting that sometimes the characters don't end up where you would expect. And that is really, I think, the work of a novelist, is to let the characters let you know who they are, rather than to try to impose upon them, what you think they should do or what you would do if you were them.
We started with the quote about sometimes women do like women from Virginia Woolf.
Yes.
A lot of the emotional energy of this book is around them not liking each other. And
Oh, you think so?
well, or at least, like they're thwarted in their like for each other, I guess. And this is, I mean, maybe the like outside forces, but then also some like inside pride and emotionality that, lead to hurt feelings that then
There's
stew.
anger.
Right.
There's anger. Yeah, but that anger is the other side of the coin of love,
Right.
right? That as you're saying, they have been thwarted in their connection to one another. But and Cece expresses this more than Gertie, because Gertie is somewhat oblivious, to why things haven't quite worked out. And so part of the process here is that, Cece is trying to understand why their friendship failed, when they were children, but she also really still loves Gertie, deeply. And Gertie has the same feeling in return. And, to give her some credit, in adolescence really did try to reach out to Cece and to renew the friendship. But Cece at that point was just trying to basically to survive, right? To get her education and move on with her life. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding that takes place, which, honestly is the stuff of fiction. If there's no misunderstanding, there's no story.
True enough. Yeah.
And so it really about how love can return. And of course, there's other storylines in the novel in terms of love. And this is where, for me, women do like women. There's the grandmother who early on warns, her granddaughter Cece in childhood to really be careful about, not understanding her connections to other people and to valorizing her connections to other women. Margie tells her the same story at different times in her life, to really to care about, her sister, about her mother, about her grandmother. Later on in life, both these women will have very strong attachments to their daughters, and there too, we'll have to uncover limitations, Gertie more than Cece, in order to love without reservation. So it's really a novel about how do you get to the point where you can accept others' limitations and blemishes and all that they present, the problems they present, and overcome maybe the prejudices that were imposed from a society or from family or from, class, to really find, the way to love.
Well, and ultimately it's through their daughters that they are able to reconnect. So, I mean, there's something to be said for like intergenerational healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's almost as if in their generation something falls apart, and then they're able to recapture some of what, especially on Cece's side, was always present in her family, in that family of women. And then, which is symbolically sort of repeated throughout the novel in terms of the living gods, like the spirits of Haiti, which are often female.
Well, the book is Village Weavers, out through Random House. Myriam, thanks very much for taking some time to talk about it, and congratulations upon its release.
Thank you so much. It's coming out April 2nd, and I hope your readers will go look for it.